I was leading a rescue mission in Iraq when the hospital called. Your daughter is in critical condition, the nurse said. Your wife's new husband hurt her. And the detective won't act his brother is the police chief without knowing who I am. Next morning, military at their door. You know what they don't tell you about war zones? It's not the bullets that'll mess you up, it's the damn phones. Mine was buzzing like an angry hornet against my Kevlar vest while I'm trying to shepherd a terrified kid through an alley that looked like God's own garbage disposal. The dust was so thick you could chew it, and the rotor wash from our birds overhead was turning the whole street into a sandblaster convention. Perfect timing for a phone call, right? The kid couldn't have been more than 8, had his tiny fingers wrapped around mine like I was his personal lifeline to not becoming street pizza. His dark eyes kept darting between the rubble and my face, probably wondering if this giant American with the funny accent was going to get him killed or get him home. I was leaning toward the latter, but hey, the day was young. That's when my sat phone decided to have a cardiac episode against my ribs. Now, let me be crystal clear about something. I don't take calls during extractions. Ever. It's like answering your phone during brain surgery or checking Instagram while your house is on fire. You just don't do it. But something in my gut, that part of me that's pure dad DNA and nothing else, made me hit that green button like it owed me money. Your daughter is in critical condition. Just like that. No hello, no is this a good time, no gentle lead-in. Just a verbal sledgehammer to the solar plexus. The nurse on the other end had this voice, scared but steady, like she'd been practicing this conversation in her head for hours. Her name was Aisha Kareem, she said, calling from St. Gabriel Children's Hospital. Even through the static and the sound of my world imploding, I could tell she was the real deal. Your wife's new husband brought her in, Aisha continued, and I swear I could hear her choosing each word like she was defusing a bomb. He claimed she fell. The injuries don't match the story. I called a detective, but he won't act. His brother is the police chief. My head started ringing like I'd been standing too close to an IED. Lily, my baby girl, my ex-wife Julia, who'd apparently traded up to some yahoo named Brent O'Malley while I was playing soldier overseas. And the cherry on top of this garbage sundae, the police chief's brother was Detective Carl Mercer, who apparently thought justice was optional when family was involved. You ever have one of those moments where time splits in half? Half of me was still in that dusty alley, holding onto this scared kid, watching my team move toward the extraction point like we'd done 100 times before. The other half was already on a plane, already in that hospital room, already figuring out which heads needed to roll. It's a weird feeling, being in 2 places at once. Wouldn't recommend it. Listen to me very carefully, I told Nurse Aisha, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I need you to photograph everything. Every bruise, every mark, every damn thing that doesn't look right. Seal my daughter's clothes in evidence bags. Do it right, chain of custody style. Keep that medical chart locked down tight. Can you do that for me? Already done, she said, and I could have kissed her through the phone. I've been a pediatric nurse for 12 years. I know what abuse looks like. I turned to Sergeant Leo Drake, my second in command, who was giving me that look, the one that said I was about to do something spectacularly stupid and he was going to have to clean up the mess. Leo's good people. Former Detroit cop who joined the Army after his partner got gunned down by some tweaker with more drugs than brain cells. He understands that some lines you don't cross. Drake, you've got point, I said, handing him the tactical lead like I was passing him a live grenade. Execute the extraction protocol. Everyone goes home. Sir, you're breaking about 17 different protocols right now, he said, but his tone was more worried than insubordinate. Command's gonna have your ass for breakfast. I looked at him, then at the kid still clinging to my hand, then at the chaos swirling around us like the world's worst snow globe. Protocol doesn't raise my kid, Sergeant. Protocol doesn't tuck her in at night, or help her with math homework, or scare away the monsters under her bed. And protocol sure as hell doesn't keep some piece of garbage from putting his hands on her. Drake nodded once, sharp, military. Understood, sir. We'll handle the cleanup here. You go handle yours. That's when I called in a favor that was going to cost me big time. Major Quentin Rhodes owed me for that mess in Kandahar where I'd pulled his sorry, but out of a firefight that should have been his last day on Earth. Quincy's got more pull with the brass than a freight train, and when I told him I needed emergency leave and transport back to the States, he didn't ask questions. Just said, consider it done. 21 minutes later, we were wheels up, and I was staring at the desert disappearing beneath us like a bad dream. But I wasn't thinking about sand or insurgents or the mission we'd just completed. I was thinking about 3 names I'd scratched onto my knee board with a tactical pen: Brent O'Malley, Detective Carl Mercer, and Chief Alan Mercer. See, here's the thing about guys like me. We don't do emotional outbursts. We don't show up screaming and throwing punches like some yahoo in a bad action movie. That's amateur hour stuff. When you've spent years learning how to dismantle networks of bad guys who think they're untouchable, you develop a different approach. You learn to pull levers instead of triggers. You learn to apply pressure in all the right places until the whole rotten structure comes tumbling down. I wasn't coming home to shout or cry or have some dramatic confrontation in a hospital corridor. I was coming home to wage war, the quiet kind, the methodical kind, the kind that starts with phone calls and paperwork and ends with handcuffs and orange jumpsuits. Because these clowns had made one crucial miscalculation. They thought being connected would protect them. They thought their little boys' club of badges and favors would keep them safe. They were about to learn the difference between local politics and federal intervention. They were about to discover that some fights you can't win by knowing the right people or greasing the right palms. And most importantly, they were about to find out what happens when you mess with a soldier's kid. The plane banked toward home, and I started making my list. 21 minutes. That's how long it took to go from holding a scared kid's hand in a dust bowl to strapping myself into a military transport that was hauling ass toward the States like its tail was on fire. In the civilian world, 21 minutes gets you through a decent sitcom episode or a really slow Starbucks line. In my world, 21 minutes was enough time to completely flip the script on everything I thought I knew about my life. The heat coming off that Iraqi runway looked like reality was having a stroke, all wavy and distorted, like someone had cranked the contrast knob on the universe until everything looked fake. But sitting there in that cargo hold, watching the desert shrink to nothing through a porthole the size of a dinner plate, the only thing that felt real was the white-hot ball of rage sitting in my chest like a coal that wouldn't burn out. You know what they don't tell you about emergency flights? The silence. Sure, the engines are screaming and the whole bird is shaking like it's coming apart at the rivets. But inside your head, it's dead quiet. Just you and whatever demon you're carrying across the ocean. Mine had a name. Actually, it had 3 names, all scribbled on my knee board in handwriting that looked like I'd been writing during an earthquake. I pulled out my encrypted phone, the kind that makes the NSA proud, and started typing messages to the only 3 people on planet Earth who could help me turn this nightmare around. First up was Colonel Miriam Stone, retired, my old commanding officer who'd basically invented the art of getting things done without asking permission from every pencil pusher between here and Washington. Miriam's got this reputation for being able to move mountains, and by mountains, I mean bureaucrats who think their job is to sit on their hands while kids get hurt. Miriam. I typed, keeping it short because encrypted messages aren't the place for war and peace. Need a federal favor. Child abuse case. Local PD compromised. Moving fast. We'll explain when boots hit ground. Second message went to Rafael Ortiz, this investigative journalist who'd been chasing corruption stories like a bloodhound with a journalism degree. Rafa's got this annoying habit of being right about everything, especially when it comes to cops who think their badges make them bulletproof. Word on the street was he'd been sniffing around the Mercer family for years, just waiting for someone to crack the door open wide enough for him to stick his foot in. Rafa, I pecked out. Remember that Mercer story you've been sitting on? Today's your Christmas morning. Call you when I land. The third message was the longest, because it was going to Priya Desai, and Priya doesn't do anything halfway. She's this child advocacy social worker who knows the system better than the people who built it. Every loophole, every pressure point, every way to make bureaucrats squirm when they're trying to sweep something under the rug. If you want someone who can navigate hospitals and courtrooms like she's got GPS coordinates for justice, Priya's your girl. Priya, incoming child abuse case, potential law enforcement obstruction. Need someone who knows hospitals and courts. Speed is everything. Details when I'm stateside. Hit send on all 3, then leaned back against the cargo netting and tried not to think about what Lily looked like right now. That's a dangerous road. Letting your imagination run wild when your kid's in the hospital and you're stuck in a flying metal tube somewhere over the Atlantic. Your brain starts painting pictures you can't unsee, and before you know it, you're planning 17 different ways to commit homicide without leaving fingerprints. Instead, I focused on what I knew for sure. Systems protect the people who build them. That's not some philosophical bullshit. That's cold, hard reality. Cops protect cops, politicians protect politicians, and everybody else can get bent. It's not personal, it's just how the machine works. But here's the thing about machines, they've got weak points. Pressure points. Places where you can stick a crowbar and watch the whole thing come apart like a cheap watch. The Mercer brothers thought they had the perfect setup. Chief Alan Mercer runs the police department like his own personal kingdom, and Detective Carl Mercer handles anything that might embarrass the family. Neat, tidy, bulletproof. Except they forgot one tiny detail. Federal jurisdiction trumps local politics every single time. You can own every cop in town, but you can't own the FBI. You can control the local newspaper, but you can't control a journalist with national connections. My phone buzzed with responses faster than I expected. Colonel Stone was in. No questions, no hesitation, just a crisp "Roger that." Standing by. Raphael sent back a string of Spanish profanity that roughly translated to "hell yes, let's burn these bastards down," but in much more colorful language. Priya's response was the longest, a detailed breakdown of what she'd need to build an airtight case, complete with contact information for federal agents who specialized in cases involving law enforcement corruption. The plane hit some turbulence, and for a minute I felt like I was back in that dusty alley with mortars dropping too close for comfort. But this wasn't random violence. This was personal. Some jackass with a badge and a family connection had decided my daughter was expendable, that her pain was an acceptable price for his convenience. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was thinking geography was going to protect them. See, they figured I was safely tucked away in a war zone, playing soldier while they played house with my family. They thought distance meant safety. What they didn't realize was that the same training that made me good at hunting bad guys overseas worked just fine on the home front. The ocean stretched out below us like a challenge. All that water between me and Lily, like someone had drawn a line in the sand and dared me to cross it. But I wasn't some weekend warrior dad who was going to show up and make a scene. I was a professional problem solver, and the Mercer family had just become my next assignment. I closed my eyes and started planning. Not the angry, emotional kind of planning that gets you arrested for assault. The cold, methodical kind that gets results. By the time we touched down, I'd have a federal task force, a journalist with a grudge, and a social worker who knew every judge in the state. The Mercers were about to learn the difference between local influence and federal heat. Wheels down in 6 hours. Game time. You know what hits you first when you walk into a children's hospital? It's not the antiseptic smell or the squeaky clean floors that look like someone attacked them with a fire hose and industrial bleach. It's the silence underneath all the noise, the kind of quiet that comes from kids who are too hurt to cry and parents who've run out of prayers. St. Gabriel Children's Hospital had that silence in spades, hanging in the air like smoke you can't wave away. Nurse Aisha Karim was waiting for me at the ER doors like she'd been planted there. And let me tell you something. This woman didn't mess around with pleasantries. No, "How was your flight?" Or "Thanks for coming so quickly." Just a sharp nod and eyes that said she'd seen enough bullshit to last 3 lifetimes. She had this way of walking that reminded me of the good sergeants I'd served with. Purposeful, like every step was calculated to get her exactly where she needed to be without wasting a single second. "Room 314, she said, leading me through corridors that were too bright, too white, too clean for the kind of darkness we were dealing with. "I need to warn you before we go in. It's worse than what I described on the phone." Worse. The word hit me like a gut punch, but I kept walking because that's what you do. You put one foot in front of the other until you get where you need to be, even when every instinct is screaming at you to turn around and find the nearest punching bag. The elevator ride lasted about 17 years, with Muzak playing some butchered version of Yesterday that made me want to rip the speakers out with my bare hands. Room 314 was a monument to everything wrong with the world. Too white, too sterile, too full of machines that beeped like electronic heartbeats counting down to something nobody wanted to think about. But none of that mattered once I saw Lily lying in that hospital bed, looking smaller than I remembered, paler than any 8-year-old should ever look. The bruises were what got me first, dark purple fingerprints wrapped around her wrist like some sick piece of jewelry. But it was the marks on her back that made me taste copper and see red around the edges of my vision. You don't get marks like that from falling downstairs or tripping over toys. You get marks like that from someone who enjoys causing pain, someone who gets off on hurting kids who can't fight back. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, forcing myself to document every bruise, every mark, every piece of evidence that would nail these bastards to the wall. My hands were steady. Military training kicks in when you need it most. But inside, I was coming apart like a cheap suit in a thunderstorm. Aisha handed me a manila envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Inside were sealed evidence bags containing Lily's clothes, a pink shirt with unicorns on it, and little denim leggings that were still damp in places that made my stomach lurch. But the real treasure was the USB drive she slipped me along with the clothes. I recorded my phone call with Detective Carl Mercer, she said, keeping her voice low like we were discussing state secrets. You need to hear this. I plugged the drive into my phone and hit play, and what I heard made me want to put my fist through the nearest wall. Detective Mercer's voice came through the tiny speaker's sounding board, like he was discussing the weather or what to have for lunch. Look, lady, kids fall down all the time. You hospital people get paranoid about every bump and scrape. Drop it. Drop it. 2 words that basically translated to, we don't give a damn about your daughter because it's inconvenient for us to care. 2 words that told me everything I needed to know about the quality of law enforcement in this particular corner of America. That's when Julia decided to make her grand entrance, walking into the room like she owned the place. She still had that same perfume, something expensive that probably cost more than most people make in a week, and that same cold smile that used to make me think she was mysterious instead of just empty inside. Now she looked like what she'd always been, a woman who'd trade her own kids' safety for social convenience. We should talk before you do anything stupid, she said, and her tone had that condescending edge that used to make me want to sleep on the couch rather than deal with another argument about money or priorities or why I cared more about other people's kids overseas than my own family. No, I said, and the word came out harder than I intended. I'll talk after I make 3 phone calls. One to a lawyer who specializes in federal civil rights violations, one to a journalist who's been dying to write a story about the Mercer family, and one to the military liaison who doesn't answer to your brother-in-law or anybody else in this joke of a police department. Her smile cracked like ice on a warm day. For the first time since I'd known her, Julia looked genuinely worried. See, the thing about people who play games with other people's lives is they get comfortable thinking everyone else is playing by the same rules. They think marriage is about keeping secrets and family is about maintaining appearances and justice is something you can buy with the right connections. But I wasn't the same guy she divorced while I was deployed, the one who used to bend over backwards trying to keep the peace. That guy died somewhere between the phone call in Iraq and the plane ride home. The guy standing in this hospital room had spent years learning how to dismantle networks of people who thought they were untouchable. You don't know who you're messing with, she said, but her voice had lost that confident edge. Now she sounded like what she was, scared. Actually, I said, watching her face change as the implications started sinking in, I think you're the one who doesn't know who you're messing with anymore. See, the guy you married and divorced was trying to save the world one village at a time. The guy you're talking to now is just trying to save his daughter. And that makes me a lot more dangerous than you remember. She turned and walked out without another word, leaving behind nothing but that expensive perfume and the smell of fear. The room felt cleaner without her in it, like someone had opened a window and let the poison air escape. Aisha was watching me with those sharp eyes, probably trying to figure out if I was going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. What happens now? She asked. I looked at my daughter, sleeping in that hospital bed with machines monitoring her breathing, and made a promise that I intended to keep. Now we make some phone calls, I said. And then we watch these bastards learn the difference between local politics and federal justice. Dawn came up over the city like God was having second thoughts about the whole sunrise thing, all gray and reluctant, like it didn't want to shed light on whatever ugliness was about to unfold. I was sitting in Mel's Diner on 5th Street at 0530 hours, nursing coffee that could strip paint and watching the door for Rafael Ortiz. Mel's was one of those places that looked like it had been decorated by someone's grandmother in 1987 and nobody had bothered to update it since. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps, and a smell that was part bacon grease, part industrial cleaner, and part broken dreams. Raphael walked in at exactly 0535, and the first thing I noticed was that he looked like he hadn't slept in about 3 days. His hair was doing that thing where it can't decide which direction it wants to grow. His shirt looked like he'd grabbed it off the floor, and he had that slightly manic gleam in his eyes that investigative journalists get when they smell blood in the water. He slid into the booth across from me carrying a leather messenger bag that looked older than both of us combined. "You know," he said, pulling out a flash drive that was smaller than my thumb. "I've been sitting on this story for 8 years, waiting for someone with the balls and the standing to crack it wide open. Turns out all I needed was a pissed-off dad with federal connections and a security clearance." The flash drive looked innocent enough, just a piece of plastic and circuitry that probably cost about $5 at Best Buy. But when Raphael plugged it into his laptop and started clicking through files, I realized I was looking at enough evidence to bury the Mercer family so deep they'd need archaeological equipment to find them. We're talking about sealed complaints that mysteriously disappeared from the system, hospital logs that showed a pattern of suspicious injuries getting written off as accidents, and police reports that had been redacted so heavily they looked like government UFO documents. "Holy shit," I said, scrolling through page after page of what looked like a systematic cover-up spanning nearly a decade. "How the hell did you get all this?" Raphael grinned like a shark who'd just spotted a wounded swimmer. "You'd be amazed how many nurses, social workers, and beat cops have been keeping their own copies of reports, just in case someone ever came along who could actually do something with them. Turns out half the department knows the Mercer brothers are dirty. They just needed someone with enough juice to make it stick." One file in particular caught my attention, a case from 3 years ago involving a 6-year-old girl who'd been brought to St. Gabriel's with injuries that the attending physician had described as consistent with systematic abuse. The detective assigned to the case? Carl Mercer. The final disposition? Case closed due to insufficient evidence, despite the fact that the medical examiner's report was more damning than a DNA test at a paternity hearing. "You are the missing piece," Raphael said, tapping the screen with a finger that had ink stains under the nail. "You're the father with military standing, federal connections, and a daughter who was victimized by the same system that's been protecting these clowns for years. You can tear the lid off this thing in a way that nobody else could." From Mel's, I drove straight to a federal annex building downtown that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought intimidating bureaucracy was an architectural style. All concrete and glass and security checkpoints that made you feel like you were entering a minimum security prison. But inside that building was Colonel Miriam Stone, and when I walked into her temporary office, I felt like I was back in the Army for the first time since my discharge. Miriam looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play a retired military officer who could still kick ass and take names. Gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, uniform that looked like it had been pressed with a steam iron and a prayer, and eyes that could see through bullshit from about 3 counties away. She was sitting across from Special Agent Dana Cho, who had the kind of quiet intensity that made you think she probably spent her weekends reading case files for fun. "Agent Cho is with the Federal Task Force on Crimes Against Children," Miriam said without bothering with small talk. "She specializes in cases involving law enforcement obstruction and official misconduct. I thought you two should meet." Agent Cho looked like she could have been anyone's suburban mom. Medium height, brown hair, the kind of face that would blend into a crowd at a soccer game. But when she started talking about child exploitation cases and corruption patterns, her voice had this surgical precision that made me think she probably knew more about the dark side of human nature than most people learn in a lifetime. "I've reviewed the preliminary materials your journalist friend provided," she said, opening a manila folder that was thicker than a phone book. "What you've stumbled onto here isn't just a case of local corruption. It's a systematic pattern of official misconduct that falls under federal jurisdiction. Civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to deny due process. We're talking about RICO predicate offenses." I handed over everything I had: the photos of Lily's injuries, the sealed evidence bags with her clothes, the audio recording of Detective Mercer telling Nurse Aisha, to drop it, and my sworn statement detailing everything that had happened from the phone call in Iraq to the confrontation with Julia in the hospital room. Agent Cho listened like she was taking inventory of a crime scene, asking sharp questions that cut right to the heart of what mattered. "This is bigger than one man hurting one child," she said finally, closing the folder with a sound like a coffin lid slamming shut. "What you've given us is the spine of a federal case that's going to bring down a network of corruption that's been operating with impunity for years. You just gave us the missing witness with the standing to make it all stick." She opened a drawer in the conference table and pulled out a digital recorder that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. "We move now," she said, hitting the record button, "before they have time to destroy evidence or coordinate their stories or disappear into the bureaucratic maze they've been hiding behind." The recorder's red light started blinking, and I realized we'd just crossed the point of no return. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And justice, as it turns out, has its own timeline that doesn't give a damn about anyone's convenience or connections or family ties. "State your name for the record," Agent Cho said, and I smiled for the first time since that phone call in Iraq. "Time to burn it all down." You know what's beautiful about federal coordination? It's like watching a Swiss watch made of badges and warrants. Every piece moving in perfect synchronization, every timing calculated down to the second. By late afternoon, Agent Cho had assembled what looked like the cast of a really expensive action movie. CID investigators who specialized in military-connected cases, HHSOIG agents who knew how to follow money trails through bureaucratic mazes, federal marshals who looked like they bench-pressed small cars for fun, and military police who understood that sometimes justice requires a little extra muscle. The coordination meeting happened in a conference room that smelled like bad coffee and good intentions. Agent Cho stood at the head of a table covered with maps, photographs, and arrest warrants that had more signatures on them than a high school yearbook. She moved through the operational plan like a conductor leading an orchestra, making sure every agency knew their part in what was about to become the Mercer family's worst Tuesday morning in recorded history. "We do not go to the local station," she emphasized, tapping the map with a laser pointer that probably cost more than my monthly combat pay. "These people own that building. They own those walls. They own every desk and filing cabinet and coffee machine. We go around them, over them, and through them, but we do not give them home field advantage." The plan was elegantly simple, which is usually the sign of someone who knows what they're doing. 2 simultaneous operations: Brent O'Malley's suburban castle and Chief Alan Mercer's McMansion on the other side of town. No phone calls, no warnings, no courtesy notifications to give these clowns time to lawyer up or coordinate their stories. Just a dark tide of federal authority rolling up to their front doors at exactly 0607 hours, because apparently Agent Cho believed in the psychological impact of getting people out of bed before their brains were fully operational. I spent the night in a hotel room that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought generic business traveler was a legitimate design philosophy. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige bedspread that probably came with a certificate of mediocrity. But I wasn't there to critique interior design. I was there to stare at the ceiling and think about Lily sleeping in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped like electronic lullabies counting down the hours until justice finally showed up to the party. Sleep was pretty much a non-starter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those finger-shaped bruises around Lily's wrist, heard Detective Mercer's bored voice telling a nurse to drop it, smelled Julia's expensive perfume mixed with the antiseptic air of a children's hospital. So I did what soldiers do when sleep won't come. I cleaned my gear, checked my phone for updates, and mentally rehearsed everything that could go wrong with tomorrow's operation. At 0530, I was dressed and caffeinated and sitting in the parking lot of a Dunkin' Donuts that looked like it was staffed entirely by people who'd given up on life before their second cup of coffee. Agent Cho pulled up in a black SUV that screamed federal government, so loudly it might as well have had sirens and flashing lights. She was wearing tactical gear that looked like it had been personally fitted by someone who understood that looking professional while kicking down doors was an art form. "Ready?" she asked, and I nodded because what else do you say when someone's about to serve justice on a silver platter with a side of handcuffs? The drive to Brent's neighborhood was like traveling through the American dream as marketed by a realtor with a cocaine habit. Perfect lawns, perfect driveways, perfect mailboxes lined up like soldiers in suburbia's army of conformity. The kind of place where domestic violence hides behind manicured hedges and child abuse gets covered up by homeowners association fees. Brent O'Malley lived on Maple Street, because of course he did. His house was one of those cookie-cutter colonials that looked like it had been ordered from a catalog called Generic White Guy Success. Two-car garage, circular driveway, security system stickers on the windows that probably cost more than most people's cars. The kind of place that screamed, "I've got nothing to hide," so loudly that you knew the owner definitely had something to hide. At exactly 0607, the federal cavalry arrived like the wrath of God with better legal documentation. No sirens, no flashing lights, no dramatic Hollywood nonsense. Just a convoy of dark vehicles that rolled onto Maple Street like they owned the place. Which, legally speaking, they kind of did. I watched from Agent Cho's SUV as two plainclothes agents approached the front door while uniformed officers took positions at the corners of the house. These weren't local cops who might have drinking buddies in common with the target. These were federal professionals who understood that corruption investigations require people who can't be bought, intimidated, or sweet-talked into looking the other way. The door opened, and Brent O'Malley stepped out looking like a man who'd just realized his luck had finally run out. He tried the usual suburban white guy bluster. "What's this about? Do you know who I'm married to? I'm calling my lawyer," but it died pretty fast when they showed him the warrant and started reading him his rights. Inside the house, the search team moved like they'd done this dance 100 times before. They found Brent's phone, which probably contained enough text messages to incriminate half the city government. They found a small leather bag hidden in the bedroom closet that matched Lily's description of the special bag her stepfather used when he wanted to teach lessons. They found bank records that showed payments to Detective Carl Mercer going back 3 years. But the real prize was Brent himself, standing in his driveway in handcuffs, finally understanding that his connection to the police chief wasn't going to save him from federal charges that carried sentences measured in decades rather than months. Across town, a second team was serving Chief Alan Mercer with his own wake-up call. The chief came out of his house in a t-shirt and bare feet, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, finally getting a taste of what it felt like to be on the wrong end of a badge. By 0800, both men were in federal custody, and Agent Cho was fielding phone calls from defense attorneys who suddenly realized their usual tricks weren't going to work against prosecutors who didn't care about local politics or family connections or who knew whom at the country club. I stood in Brent's driveway, watching the neighbors peek through their curtains like they were witnessing the apocalypse, and felt something I hadn't felt since that phone call in Iraq: hope. Not the warm, fuzzy kind of hope you get from greeting cards, but the cold, hard kind that comes from watching bullies finally meet someone bigger than they are. The system that had failed my daughter was about to learn what federal jurisdiction really meant. You know what's faster than gossip in a small town? Federal arrests hitting social media when half the city government gets perp-walked before breakfast. By 0900, my phone was blowing up like a Taliban ammunition depot, buzzing and chirping with calls from numbers I recognized, numbers I didn't, and numbers that probably belonged to reporters who'd sold their souls for a good story and were now smelling Pulitzer Prize potential in the morning air. The news broke on Channel 7 first, probably because Raphael had friends in all the right places and understood the value of timing. Police chief arrested in federal child abuse cover-up probe. The headline crawled across the bottom of every screen in the city like a virus spreading through the local power structure's worst nightmare. By mid-morning, it wasn't just local news. CNN picked it up, then Fox, then every blogger and podcaster who'd ever complained about police corruption had something to say about the Mercer family's spectacular fall from grace. I was holed up in my rental car outside St. Gabriel's Hospital, watching the media circus set up camp on the front lawn like they were preparing for a siege. News vans with satellite dishes, reporters checking their hair and phone cameras, photographers with lenses long enough to spot corruption from orbit. The whole scene looked like democracy having a messy public breakdown, which, when you think about it, was pretty much exactly what was happening. My phone rang for the 20th time in an hour, and I let it go to voicemail along with all the others. Reporters wanting quotes, old army buddies who'd seen my name in the news, distant relatives suddenly remembering they had my number. Even got a call from some producer in Hollywood who wanted to know if I'd sold the movie rights yet. Because apparently nothing says American justice like turning your kids' trauma into entertainment for people who eat popcorn in the dark. At 0912, Julia showed up at my temporary command post, which was basically a rented Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot. She brought Detective Carl Mercer with her, and the two of them looked like they were heading to a funeral, which, considering what had happened to their little protection racket, they basically were. Julia was wearing her serious conversation face, the one she used to put on when she wanted to discuss money or why I spent too much time overseas or whether we should refinance the house. Carl looked like someone had told him Santa Claus was actually a federal prosecutor. They walked up to my car like they owned the place, which was pretty ballsy considering one of them was married to a guy who was currently enjoying federal hospitality and the other one was probably going to join him before lunch. Julia tapped on my window with fingernails that probably cost more than most people's grocery budget, wearing that smile that used to make me think she was being mysterious instead of manipulative. I rolled the window down exactly 2 inches, enough to hear whatever bullshit they were selling, not enough to make it feel like a friendly conversation. "We need to talk," Julia said, using that tone that suggested this was somehow my fault. "Before you make this situation worse for everyone, including Lily." "Interesting theory," I said, keeping my voice flat as a runway. "Here's mine. You and Detective Dumbass there need to get away from my car before I call Agent Cho and let her know you're attempting to intimidate a federal witness." Carl stepped forward, probably forgetting that his badge didn't carry much weight when his boss was wearing handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. "Look, we can work this out. Family business should stay family business. Nobody needs to get hurt here." I looked at him through that 2-inch gap in the window and wondered if he'd practiced that speech in the mirror or if stupidity just came naturally to him. "Detective Mercer," I said, "your brother is in federal custody. Your brother-in-law is looking at 20 years in prison, and you're standing in a hospital parking lot trying to intimidate the father of an abuse victim. If you think this situation can get any worse for you, I'm happy to prove you wrong." Julia's mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine fear. Not the social anxiety she used to get when she thought people were judging her outfit or her car or her choice in husbands. This was the kind of fear that comes when you realize the game is over and you're standing on the wrong side of history with your ass hanging out in the wind. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, because people like Julia would rather burn the whole world down than admit they were wrong. "You think you're some kind of hero?" she hissed through that window gap. "You destroyed a family. You destroyed careers. You destroyed lives." "No," I said, and my voice came out colder than I intended. "I protected my daughter. The rest of you destroyed yourselves." That's when Colonel Miriam Stone pulled up in a government sedan that looked like it had been designed by people who understood that intimidation was a form of communication. She got out wearing her dress uniform and the kind of expression that made junior officers check their shoelaces and senior officers remember urgent appointments somewhere else. Julia and Carl took one look at 6 feet of retired military officer walking toward them like justice in a pressed uniform and suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. They scurried back to their car faster than cockroaches when someone turns on the kitchen lights. Colonel Stone watched them drive away, then walked over to my window with an manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. "Assistant District Attorney Sophia Park is expecting you," she said. "She's got bank transfers, text messages, and a timeline that puts your ex-wife and her husband exactly where your daughter said they were when the abuse happened." Meanwhile, across town, Major Rhodes and Agent Cho were holding a joint press briefing that was getting more coverage than a presidential election. They didn't mention my name. Federal investigations protect witnesses, unlike local police departments that leak information like sieves. But they made it clear that this case mattered, that children's voices would be heard, and that nobody was above the law. The reporters asked the usual questions about jurisdiction and evidence, and whether there would be more arrests. Agent Cho answered with the kind of professional precision that made it clear she'd done this dance before. But when some jackass from the back row asked whether this was just federal overreach targeting local law enforcement, her expression went arctic. This investigation began when a nurse called to report suspected child abuse and a detective told her to drop it, she said. "If that's what you consider legitimate law enforcement, then we have very different definitions of the word legitimate." By noon, The story had legs and was running marathons across every news platform in America. The Mercer family's protection racket was front-page news, and suddenly everyone who'd ever been told to drop it by local police was finding their voice. My phone buzzed with a text from Raphael. "Check your email. We're just getting started." I smiled for the first time all day. Sometimes justice needs a little help going viral. You know what's funny about courtrooms? They're designed to look like justice actually lives there. All that polished wood and fancy carpet and marble that probably cost more than most people's houses. Like someone figured if you made the room impressive enough, truth would feel obligated to show up for the party. The federal courthouse downtown had all the bells and whistles. High ceilings that made every whisper echo like a confession. Windows that let in just enough light to make everyone look either angelic or guilty, depending on where they sat. And that particular smell that courtrooms have. Part furniture polish, part fear, part the lingering ghosts of every lie that had ever been told under oath. 2 days after the arrests, the place was packed tighter than a subway car during rush hour. The Mercers' friends from City Hall had claimed the back benches like they were at a high school football game. All of them wearing their "this is a terrible misunderstanding" faces while secretly calculating how much distance they needed to put between themselves and the sinking ship. You could practically hear the sound of loyalty evaporating in real time. I was sitting in the third row, right behind Assistant District Attorney Sophia Park, who looked like she'd been born to stand in front of juries and explain why bad people deserved bad things to happen to them. Sophia had this way of organizing evidence that reminded me of watching a Master Sergeant field strip a rifle. Every piece had its place, every movement was efficient, and when she was done, you had something that could definitely do some damage. Judge Althea Monroe took the bench at exactly 0900. And let me tell you something about Judge Monroe. She had the kind of presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter and remember their manners. 20 years on the federal bench, 15 years before that as a prosecutor who specialized in cases involving children, and a reputation for being tougher than overcooked steak when it came to people who hurt kids. If you were a defendant in her courtroom, you'd better come correct or go home disappointed. Ada Park stood up and started laying out the case like she was building a house. Foundation first, then walls, then a roof that would keep all the evidence nice and dry. She began with Nurse Aisha's photographs, blown up on a screen that made those finger-shaped bruises around Lily's wrist look like they'd been painted with purple ink. The courtroom went dead quiet, the kind of silence that happens when people realize they're looking at something that's going to give them nightmares. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Park said, her voice carrying across the courtroom like it owned the place. This case began when a pediatric nurse saw injuries that didn't match the story she was told. It continued when she called the police and was told to drop it. And it ends today, with you deciding whether a badge gives someone the right to ignore a child's pain. She moved through the evidence like a conductor leading an orchestra, each piece building on the last. The sealed evidence bags containing Lily's clothes, still tagged and photographed according to chain of custody procedures that would make a forensics textbook proud. My sworn statement, delivered via video link because apparently my security clearance made me too valuable to risk in an open courtroom. The audio recording of Detective Carl Mercer telling Nurse Aisha to drop it when she called about a suspected child abuse case. But the real showstopper was Raphael's work. 8 years of investigative journalism condensed into a timeline that looked like a roadmap to hell. Hospital admissions that had been mysteriously misfiled. Police reports that had been buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa. Complaints that had disappeared into the bureaucratic equivalent of a black hole. Every case had the same pattern. Suspicious injuries, concerned medical professionals, and Detective Carl Mercer making sure nothing ever went anywhere. The courtroom erupted in gasps and muttered conversations when Park displayed the bank records showing payments from Brent O'Malley to Detective Mercer going back 3 years. Not huge amounts, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, but consistent enough to establish a pattern that any jury member with half a brain could recognize as what it was. Payments for services rendered. Then came the text messages, and that's when things got really ugly. Ada Park read them out loud in that clear, professional voice that made every word sound like a nail being hammered into a coffin. From Brent O'Malley to Julia O'Malley, 2 days before Lily was hospitalized. Kid needs to learn some respect. Time for a lesson. From Julia O'Malley to Brent O'Malley, The same day. Just don't leave marks where people can see them. From Brent O'Malley to Detective Carl Mercer, the day Lily was admitted to the hospital. We have a situation. Need it handled quietly. From Detective Carl Mercer to Brent O'Malley, 2 hours later. Consider it handled. Kids fall all the time. But the message that really drove the nail home was Julia's response when Brent texted her about the hospital asking too many questions. She'll survive. Maybe she'll learn to stay in her place. The silence in that courtroom was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it for dinner. I watched the jury members' faces as they processed what they'd just heard. 12 ordinary people realizing they were looking at the kind of evil that hides behind suburban respectability and family connections. Judge Monroe's expression went from judicial neutrality to something that looked like she was calculating how many years of prison time would be sufficient to balance the scales of justice. Her pen had stopped moving across her notepad, and she was staring at the defendant's table like she was trying to figure out what species of human could write those messages about a child. When Ada Park displayed the photographs of Lily's injuries alongside the text messages, the impact was devastating. You could literally watch the defendant's lawyers realizing that their usual bag of tricks, character witnesses, procedural challenges, reasonable doubt arguments, weren't going to work against evidence that damning. Brent O'Malley sat at the defendant's table looking like someone had explained to him that karma was real and it had his home address. His expensive lawyer kept shuffling papers like he was looking for a miracle hidden somewhere in the legal briefs. Detective Carl Mercer stared at his hands, probably wondering how 20 years of being a cop had led to sitting in federal court wearing handcuffs and shame. But Julia was the most interesting to watch. She kept trying to catch my eye, wearing that same manipulative smile she used to use when she wanted me to forget about whatever she'd done wrong this time. Like she thought she could charm her way out of federal charges the same way she used to charm her way out of taking responsibility for anything. Ada Park saved the best for last, a recorded statement from Lily, taken by a child psychologist in a setting designed to make kids feel safe. The jury listened to my 8-year-old daughter describe, in her own words, what her stepfather had done to her and how her mother had told her to keep it, their special secret. When the recording ended, Judge Monroe called for a 15-minute recess, and I watched 12 jurors file out looking like they'd just witnessed a car accident. The Mercer's supporters in the back rows suddenly found the exit doors very interesting. Justice, it turned out, looked a lot brighter when you turned up all the lights. You know what's beautiful about watching a house of cards fall down? It doesn't happen all at once. First one card wobbles, then another starts to lean, and before you know it, the whole structure is collapsing faster than a politician's promises during election season. The Mercer family protection racket started coming apart the minute Brent O'Malley realized that federal prosecutors don't give a damn about local politics or family connections or how much money you donate to the Police Benevolent Association. It was day 3 of the trial, and Brent's lawyer, some overpriced suit from a downtown firm that probably charged more per hour than most people make in a month, was having what you might politely call a nervous breakdown. He kept shuffling through papers like he was looking for a get-out-of-jail-free card that definitely wasn't there, sweating through a shirt that probably cost more than my car payment, and shooting desperate looks at the jury like he was hoping one of them might suddenly develop selective blindness. That's when Brent decided to cut his losses and throw everyone else under the bus so hard they'd need tire tracks as evidence. His lawyer stood up and announced that his client wanted to cooperate with the prosecution, which is legal speak for, "We're totally screwed, and we're willing to screw everyone else if it means we might get to see daylight again before we're collecting Social Security." The plea hearing was like watching a grown man wet himself in public, except instead of embarrassment, it was federal charges, and instead of a change of clothes, it was a plea agreement that would keep him from spending the rest of his life in a concrete box. Brent sat at that defendant's table looking like someone had explained to him that karma was real and it had been taking notes. "Your Honor," Brent's lawyer said, his voice shaking like he'd been mainlining espresso and anxiety. "My client wishes to accept responsibility for his actions and cooperate fully with the government's ongoing investigation into official corruption and obstruction of justice." Judge Monroe looked at Brent like she was trying to decide whether he deserved a life sentence or just a really long one. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, her voice colder than a Minnesota winter, "do you understand that by pleading guilty, you're admitting to systematically abusing a child and then conspiring with law enforcement officers to cover up your crimes? Brent nodded like a bobblehead with a nervous condition. Yes, Your Honor. I also understand that my cooperation agreement requires me to provide complete and truthful testimony about the role played by Julia O'Malley, Detective Carl Mercer, and Chief Alan Mercer in obstructing this investigation. And just like that, the floodgates opened. Brent started spilling secrets like a drunk girl at a slumber party, except instead of gossip about who kissed whom behind the gymnasium, it was detailed testimony about how the Mercer brothers had been running interference for abusers for years. He told the court about cash payments, about phone calls telling him not to worry because Carl has it handled, about Julia coaching him on what to say if anyone asked questions about Lily's injuries. The best part, and by best, I mean the part that made me want to reach across that courtroom and shake his hand before punching him in the face, was when he described how the system worked. Concerned citizens would call the police about suspicious injuries or strange behavior from kids in the neighborhood. Detective Carl Mercer would take the calls, file reports that looked official, and then make sure those reports disappeared into the bureaucratic equivalent of a black hole. Meanwhile, Chief Alan Mercer would handle any federal inquiries by claiming jurisdiction and promising thorough investigations that never actually happened. It was a beautiful system, really, if you were the kind of sociopath who thought protecting child abusers was a legitimate use of taxpayer money and law enforcement authority. Detective Carl Mercer folded next, because apparently watching your co-conspirator throw you under the bus will make you reconsider your loyalty to the cause. His plea hearing was even more pathetic than Brent's, mostly because he spent the whole time trying to convince Judge Monroe that he was really a good cop who'd just made some bad decisions. Which is like saying Jeffrey Dahmer was really a good neighbor who just had some unusual dietary preferences. Your Honor, Detective Mercer said, his voice cracking like a 13-year-old boy asking someone to prom. I want to take responsibility for my actions and make amends for the harm I've caused to the community and to the children I swore to protect. Judge Monroe looked at him like she was calculating how much bullshit she was willing to tolerate in her courtroom on any given Tuesday. Detective Mercer, she said, you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community. Instead, you used your badge and your authority to protect child abusers from the consequences of their actions. What exactly do you think making amends looks like in a situation like this? Carl Mercer didn't have an answer for that one. Probably because there isn't a good answer when you've spent years telling hospital workers to drop child abuse cases because they were inconvenient for your family's political ambitions. But the real show was Chief Alan Mercer, who tried to maintain his dignity right up until Internal Affairs played a recording of him coaching another officer on how to route reports to archive status without actually investigating them. The recording was from 2 years ago, captured during what the chief thought was a private conversation in his office about how to handle sensitive cases involving prominent community members. Look, Chief Mercer's voice came through the courtroom speakers like the voice of corruption itself. Sometimes you gotta understand that being a good cop means knowing which cases deserve your full attention and which ones are better left alone. We're not social workers, we're law enforcement officers, and our job is to maintain order in the community. The other voice on the recording, later identified as Detective Mike Harrison, who'd been wearing a wire for the FBI for 6 months, asked what happened when cases involved actual crimes against children. Kids are resilient, the chief's voice replied. They bounce back. But careers and reputations? Those are harder to rebuild. You gotta think about the big picture. When that recording finished playing, you could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. Judge Monroe looked like she was personally offended that someone had wasted her time with a human being that morally bankrupt. The jury looked like they'd just watched someone kick a puppy while burning an American flag. Chief Mercer's lawyer made a valiant effort to claim the recording was taken out of context. But it's pretty hard to provide context that makes kids are resilient sound reasonable when you're talking about ignoring child abuse cases. The final piece of the puzzle was Priya Desai's testimony about Lily's trauma responses and recovery. Priya took the stand wearing her professional social worker face and explained, in terms that even the dumbest jury member could understand, exactly what systematic abuse does to a child's developing brain and why the injuries Lily sustained were absolutely not consistent with accidental falls. Children who suffer abuse at the hands of trusted adults develop complex trauma responses, Priya explained, her voice steady as a surgeon's hands. They learned to minimize their pain, to accept responsibility for their abuse, and to believe that asking for help will only make things worse. When the adults who are supposed to protect them, parents, step-parents, police officers, instead conspire to silence them, the psychological damage can be devastating and long-lasting. She also testified about why Nurse Aisha's actions were so crucial. When medical professionals recognize abuse and take appropriate action to document and report it, they send a powerful message to the child. Your pain matters, your safety matters, and there are adults in the world who will fight for you. Judge Monroe nodded along like Priya was explaining basic mathematics to kindergartners. When the defense tried to cross-examine her, Priya delivered responses that were so professional and devastating that the lawyers basically gave up and sat down. By the end of the day, the entire conspiracy had collapsed like a house built on quicksand. 3 guilty pleas, 1 cooperation agreement, and enough evidence to bury the whole Mercer organization so deep they'd need archaeological equipment to find it. Justice was starting to look pretty good in federal court. You know what's funny about justice? It doesn't sound like trumpets or feel like a Hollywood moment when it finally shows up. It sounds like a gavel hitting wood and feels like exhaling air you didn't realize you'd been holding for months. Sentencing day came faster than anyone expected, probably because Judge Monroe had seen enough evidence to convict half the city government and wasn't in the mood to let this circus drag on any longer than necessary. The federal courthouse was packed again, but this time the energy was different. Instead of the nervous anticipation of a trial, there was this sense of inevitability hanging in the air like smoke from a house fire that was finally burning itself out. The Mercers' friends from City Hall were notably absent. Nothing kills political loyalty faster than federal convictions and the prospect of guilt by association. The back rows were filled with reporters, victim advocates, and people who'd been waiting years to see the Mercer protection racket get what was coming to it. I was sitting in the same third-row seat I'd occupied during the trial, wearing my dress uniform because sometimes you need to look like justice when justice is being served. Colonel Stone was beside me, also in uniform, representing the military's interest in seeing one of their own get a fair shake from the civilian justice system. Behind us sat Rafael Ortiz, probably calculating which journalism awards he was going to win for his coverage of the case, and Priya Desai, who looked like she was personally invested in seeing every child abuser in the city get what they deserved. Judge Monroe took the bench at exactly 0900, and the first thing you noticed was her expression, the kind of cold professionalism that judges get when they're about to hand down sentences that will ruin lives. She'd spent 3 weeks listening to evidence about systematic child abuse and official corruption, and you could tell from her body language that she was done being polite about it. The defendants will rise, she said, and watching 4 adults stand up to hear their fates was like watching dominoes line up for the last time before they all fell down. Brent O'Malley was first, because apparently the court system believes in starting with the person who actually put his hands on my daughter. His lawyer. The same overpriced suit who'd been sweating through his shirts for the past month, stood beside him looking like he was attending his own funeral. Brent had lost about 20 pounds since his arrest, and his expensive haircut couldn't hide the fact that federal custody doesn't come with a personal stylist. Mr. O'Malley, Judge Monroe said, consulting her notes like she was reading a grocery list instead of destroying a man's life. You have pleaded guilty to multiple counts of felony child abuse, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and witness tampering. The court has reviewed your cooperation agreement with the government, your statements of remorse, and the letters of support from your former employers and community members. She paused, and I swear you could hear everyone in the courtroom holding their breath. However, she continued, and that word hung in the air like a sword waiting to drop. This court must also consider the systematic nature of your abuse, the vulnerability of your victim, and the fact that you used your relationship with law enforcement to ensure that your crimes would go unpunished. The pre-sentence investigation reveals a pattern of escalating violence that might have continued indefinitely without the intervention of federal authorities. The sentence came down like a hammer: 15 years federal prison, 5 years supervised release, mandatory registration as a sex offender, and a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with Lily until she reached the age of 18. The courtroom erupted in whispers and scattered applause that Judge Monroe quickly gavelled to silence. Brent's legs gave out, and his lawyer had to hold him up while the marshals prepared to escort him back to his cell. He tried to turn around and look at me, probably hoping for some sign of forgiveness or mercy, but I was busy studying my fingernails and thinking about how 15 years wasn't nearly long enough. Detective Carl Mercer was next, and watching a 20-year veteran of law enforcement get sentenced for corruption was like watching a masterclass in how not to be a cop. Carl had tried to clean himself up for sentencing. Fresh haircut, pressed uniform. The whole, "I'm really sorry, and I've learned my lesson" performance that defense lawyers probably teach in Bullshit 101. Detective Mercer, Judge Monroe said, and her voice had taken on this tone that suggested she was personally offended by having to sentence a police officer. "You took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community. Instead, you used your badge and your authority to facilitate child abuse and obstruct justice. The evidence shows that you received payments totaling over $8,000 in exchange for making child abuse investigations disappear. The sentence was brutal: 12 years federal prison, 3 years supervised release, forfeiture of all pension benefits, and a permanent ban from any law enforcement employment." Carl's wife started crying in the gallery, but Judge Monroe wasn't in the mood for sympathy. "The court notes that your actions didn't just harm individual children," she continued. "You undermined public trust in law enforcement and betrayed every honest police officer who risks their life to protect the innocent. That betrayal of public trust is an aggravating factor that this court cannot ignore." Carl's lawyer tried to argue for leniency based on his client's years of public service, but Judge Monroe shut that down faster than a bouncer at closing time. 20 years of law enforcement experience makes Detective Mercer's crimes worse, not better, she said. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway because he thought his badge would protect him from the consequences. But the real show was Chief Alan Mercer, who'd maintained his arrogant attitude right up until the moment he realized that federal judges don't care about local politics or family connections or how many charity golf tournaments you've sponsored. The chief walked to the defendant's table like he was heading to his own execution, which, metaphorically speaking, he pretty much was. "Chief Mercer," Judge Monroe said, and now her voice had taken on the tone of someone who was about to make an example out of somebody. "You held the highest law enforcement position in this city. You were entrusted with protecting the most vulnerable members of our community. Instead, you turned the police department into a criminal enterprise designed to protect child abusers from prosecution." The evidence against the chief was overwhelming. Recorded conversations about hiding evidence, bank records showing payments to offshore accounts, and testimony from half a dozen officers who'd been ordered to make cases disappear. The RICO enhancements meant he was looking at federal conspiracy charges that carried sentences measured in decades, not years. "The court finds that you operated a pattern and practice of corruption that meets the federal definition of racketeering," Judge Monroe continued. "You used your position as chief of police to obstruct justice, intimidate witnesses, and facilitate the systematic abuse of children. This court has rarely encountered such a complete abandonment of public trust." The sentence was devastating: 25 years federal prison, 10 years supervised release, forfeiture of all assets connected to his criminal enterprise, and permanent disbarment from any public employment. The chief's face went white as paper, and for the first time since his arrest, he looked like he finally understood that his connections couldn't save him from federal consequences. But Julia was the one I'd been waiting to see get her comeuppance. She tried to dress for sympathy, wearing some conservative outfit that probably came from a "how to look innocent at your federal sentencing" catalog. Her lawyer had been arguing for months that she was really a victim too, manipulated by her abusive husband into participating in crimes she didn't understand. Judge Monroe wasn't buying it. "Mrs. O'Malley," she said, reading from notes that probably contained every text message Julia had ever sent about keeping Lily's abuse quiet. "The evidence shows that you were not a passive victim in this conspiracy. You actively participated in your daughter's abuse, coached your husband on how to avoid detection, and conspired with law enforcement to ensure that your crimes would go unpunished." The text messages were read aloud again, and hearing Julia's words about teaching Lily to stay in her place, echoing through that courtroom, was like listening to evil speak its own name. The judge had obviously spent considerable time reviewing the evidence, because she quoted specific messages that showed Julia wasn't just complicit, she was enthusiastic. The court is particularly troubled by your statement that your daughter will survive and maybe she'll learn, Judge Monroe continued. That level of callousness toward a child's suffering suggests a complete lack of maternal instinct and a fundamental inability to protect the child you brought into this world. Julia's sentence was 15 years federal prison, 5 years supervised release, and permanent termination of parental rights. She wouldn't see Lily again until my daughter was an adult, and even then, only if Lily chose to have contact with her. The courtroom was dead silent as the marshals prepared to escort Julia back to federal custody. She finally tried to look at me as they were putting the handcuffs on, probably hoping for some last-minute intervention or forgiveness, or maybe just acknowledgement that we'd once been married and shared a life together. But I was looking at Judge Monroe, who was explaining the appeals process and the conditions of federal supervised release, because Julia had stopped being my problem the minute she decided my daughter's pain was an acceptable price for her convenience. The whole sentencing hearing took less than 3 hours, but watching 4 people get a combined total of 67 years in federal prison was like watching justice work in fast forward. The Mercer family name, which had been a source of political power in this city for 2 generations, was now permanently associated with child abuse and corruption. The police department they'd controlled was being investigated by federal authorities who didn't care about local traditions or family legacies. Outside the courthouse, the media circus was waiting with their cameras and microphones and questions designed to get sound bites for the evening news. They wanted to know how I felt about the sentences, whether I thought justice had been served, what I planned to do next. I walked past them without saying a word, because this wasn't about making statements or getting my 15 minutes of fame. This was about my daughter sleeping safely in her hospital bed, knowing that the people who'd hurt her were never going to hurt her again. Colonel Stone